Hello, strategic management students. Fred David here. Hope you're having a good day today. We're looking in chapter 9 today. If you'll join with me for a few minutes. Actually, I'm on page 270 in the 17th edition. Looking at that model on page 270 for strategy evaluation is the topic of chapter 9. You see in that model on page 270, there are three stages in strategic planning or strategic management: formulating, implementing, and evaluating. This chapter is on evaluating. And companies and organizations desperately need to know, are our strategies working? And it's too late sometimes to wait to see negative results on an income statement, a balance sheet. Sometimes that's like closing the barn doors after the horses have already ran out. So what companies and businesses are doing, they're trying to monitor the impact of their strategies continuously. And that's what this chapter is looking at. So I see that box highlighted on page 270, strategy evaluation, there here in chapter 9. As I look over on page 273, ironically, I see a quote there from Joseph Stalin. He said, "History shows that there are no invincible armies." What he's saying there, as analogous to a business, is that even the strongest businesses are the target for other businesses to duplicate, imitate what they're doing. So even the strongest businesses need to be wary and need to evaluate strategies on a continuous basis. To tell you the truth, this what is needed based on research related to this chapter. I see that even Peter Drucker on the middle of page 273, he says there, unless strategy evaluation is performed seriously and systematically, and unless strategists are willing to act on the results, energy will be used up defending yesterday. So Peter Drucker, is oftentimes called the father of management. He's saying there, emphasizing how important it is to engage in strategy evaluation and not just to wait till you see the bottom line, maybe perhaps negative results. So I see, as I move on over to page 274 and 275, I see that there are three activities that companies and organizations engage in evaluating their strategies. You see that the three stages are: review underlying basis of strategy, measure performance, and take corrective actions. So there are going to be three parts to this. So I see on page 275 that table 9.1. Take a look at that. I notice in the right column of table 9.1, we're going to continue on our present strategic course in only one of those scenarios. In other words, if our strengths and weaknesses have changed, or our opportunities and threats have changed, or if we're not meeting our performance targets, we'll need to take some corrective actions. You see that in table 9.1. So that's an important page there. So I see this kind of illustrated on page 276, a little flow diagram there for you. Notice activity 1, we're going to review both the internal and the external, perhaps even perform an updated IFE matrix and EFE matrix. And if there's significant differences between what we earlier had determined versus the new ones, then we're going to need to take some corrective actions. If there are no changes, we're going to measure performance. And I see on page 277, when we talk about measure performance, companies generally will, as I see on page table 9.2, have an actual result, an expected result, a variance, and an action needed. So look at that. They're looking at corporate revenues, region revenues, profits, return on investment. They had a target. They see what happened. They monitor the variance, and they are going to take some corrective actions as needed. So going to be three stages, as I see on page 276 in the flow diagram: review underlying basis of strategy, measure organizational performance, and then take corrective actions as needed. So that's what I see. And in terms of corrective actions on page 278 in table 9.3, I'll give you there 12 actions that might be necessary depending on the performance measures involved in evaluating strategies. Look at that. You may want to alter the firm structure. This is at the bottom of page 278. You may need to replace one or more key individuals, may need to divest of a division or segment, may need to alter the firm's, maybe even need to alter the firm's vision or mission. You may need to revise objectives, may need to alter strategies. So there are 12 of those right there that among many corrective actions that could be needed depending on the performance measures that, folks, I see on page 279, there's one tool that companies and businesses are widely using in terms of to help them in evaluating strategy. That's called the balanced scorecard. And I see this being talked about on page 279. And actually there's a sample one on page 280. You see that the word balance means we're going to try to balance subjective with objective measures, quantitative with qualitative. Lots of things in businesses and companies, organizations, as you well know, can't really be quantified or measured quantitatively, such as customer loyalty, employee morale, business ethics, social responsibility, environmental sustainability, those kinds of things. And so I see on page 280, what the balanced scorecard is insisting on companies do is measure the quantitative variables such as financial ratios, return on investment, those kinds of things, and other quantitative variables. But in addition, be sure to measure the subjective variables like the ones I just mentioned. I see that's kind of illustrated on page 280. Folks, on page 281, I see here a brief discussion about board of directors' duties and responsibilities. Basically, what these 2 or 3 pages are saying here with regard to governance, that's a term referred to with the board of directors. They're ultimately in charge, responsible for success of the company being successful. And I see on page 281 and 282, boards are becoming much more actively involved in strategic planning, partly because various lawsuits have held them accountable and liable for an effective strategic planning process being undertaken in the firm. And so I see on page 282, boards are becoming smaller in size, around 9 board members today, quite common, down from 18 board members a few, 5 or 6 years ago, and also fewer insiders. On average, no more, you wouldn't want any more than 2 executives, top executives to serve on the board. And certainly you don't want the CEO to be chairperson of the board. I mean, the board, that's who evaluates and compensates, let's say, the CEO annually. So it's kind of mismanagement for the CEO to be also a chairman. And as you learned earlier, it should be chairperson of the board. So I see that on page 282. Some guidelines actually given on the middle of that page there. For example, number 3 in the middle of the page, you want to require all board members to own a large amount of the firm's equity, require all board members to attend at least 75% of the meetings, you want to make sure you have diversity across the board, and so forth. So I see that on page 282. Folks, I see some challenges in strategic management talked about on page 283. The first one is art or science aspect of strategic management. You know, this book has come down on this side of science. Of course, intuition, subjectivity is always coming into play in terms of strategic planning, but we do have many analytical tools, concepts, and matrices that companies and businesses are utilizing to help make sure they have an effective strategic plan. So there's a lot of science involved in strategic planning, as you've learned already in the textbook. With regard to the visible versus hidden issue, there are companies like TJ Maxx, for example, very successful company that are very secretive in how they do virtually everything. I understand the CEO really forbids executives to even give interviews revealing what the company is doing, when, what, where, how. Very secretive. Although many companies are really quite open, quite transparent about their strategic planning. So I see on page 284 a list of reasons why you would want to be open, transparent, visible, versus why in doing strategic planning would you want to be secret or closed. So it's what you're going to be most comfortable with. Personally, I find, and looking at research on this topic, find that the open, transparent benefits outweigh the drawbacks. In other words, it's oftentimes easier to gain the necessary, the needed motivation, commitment, and understanding from top executives, employees, managers, when this process is more open or visible. But I understand the secret aspect. You see on page 284, the first number one reason there, it says free dissemination of a firm's strategies can easily transfer into competitive intelligence for rival firms. So that's why, for example, TJ Maxx keeps everything they do to the extent possible secret. They don't want rival firms to know where they're making their money, how and why, and so forth. So that's a trade-off. That's a trade-off companies make in terms of how they do strategic planning. Folks, there's some broad guidelines on page 286 and 287 for how to do strategic planning effectively. I see 6 guidelines mentioned on the top of page 287. And notice strategy evaluation, the process needs to be economical. It needs to be open-minded. It needs to provide a true picture of what's happening in terms of evaluating strategies. I mean, our declining performance might be due, for example, to an economic downturn, although our employees and managers and executives are working harder than ever. So the strategy evaluation strategies needs to provide a true picture of what the situation is. I see that being talked about on page 287. In fact, these guidelines are summarized on page 288. I like table 9.6 on page 288, provides 17 guidelines for making the strategic planning process as effective as it can be. I see number 1 there, it should be a people process, not a paper process. It should be a learning process. We need to welcome bad news and good news in evaluating strategies. Companies, businesses, organizations desperately need to know bad news if there is bad news so we can take corrective actions rather than waiting for it finally to show up in our top line and bottom line on our income statement. So I see 17 guidelines here on page 288 that are important in doing strategic planning. So folks, that's going to wrap us up here on chapter 9. In a little bit, I want to speak with you for a few minutes about business ethics, social responsibility, environmental sustainability. We've kind of merged those topics into chapter 10. So, research is really clear. Good ethics is good business. And we're going to look at that in chapter 10 upcoming. I'm hoping you'll join with me in chapter 10. And thanks for joining with me here for a few minutes in chapter 9. Have a good day. We'll see you soon.